Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger. This podcast, like all the podcasts here, is brought to you by Donors Trust, the Community Foundation for Liberty. If you care about limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise, Donors Trust is the charitable partner to choose. Learn how Donors Trust can help you at donorstrust.org/ricochet. I'll have more to say about this later in the show. It is a live show, so to speak, a show before a small audience in Washington, D.C. at the American Enterprise Institute. And I think the atmosphere today is pretty festive at this podcast summit. But my topic for this Q&A is very, very grim, about as grim as you can get. And I'll tell you how it came about. A few weeks ago, I was talking with a great and venerable scholar in America, Jerome A. Cohen, who is one of our senior China scholars. He's been at it since about 1960. And he said he was consumed at present by one thing above all, and that was the situation of the Uyghur people in northwest China. He said they were being rounded up en masse, up to 1 million of them, and thrown into re-education camps, a kind of gulag, without any due process whatsoever. This is outside the normal PRC justice system, which is no ideal, of course. And Cohen said he was very, very concerned, and it reminded him of Austria and Germany, where some 40 of his family members were murdered. Now, when someone like Cohen talks this way, you pay attention, because he's a very serious, sober guy with vast experience. He doesn't talk loosely. But he had these concerns, kind of pre-genocidal concerns. And he said the world press wasn't paying very much attention. You can't pay attention to everything. You can't keep your eye on the trajectory of every sparrow. But he said that this situation deserved more attention. So I thought we'd give it a little. And I'm sorry for this much longer than usual introduction, but a few basics before we begin, so the basics don't have to be covered later. The Uyghurs are a Turkic people, a Central Asian people in northwest China, in a province that the Chinese, the CCP, calls Xinjiang, and that the Uyghurs themselves call East Turkestan. They are Muslim generally, and they have long been oppressed, of course, by the majority Chinese. But this is something very different, this situation that's developed in the last year. So I think that may be enough from me for now. Our guest is a Uyghur American, a lawyer here in Washington. He was born in 1970 in the middle of the Cultural Revolution in a re-education camp. And he is a longtime human rights advocate. He is the chairman of the board of the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And he is Nury Turkel, N-U-R-Y, Nury Turkel, T-U-R-K-E-L. And Nury, I'm sitting here with you. You look perfectly normal, handsome guy, handsome Washington lawyer in a suit and tie. It must be very strange to get up and go about a kind of normal life. You know, shaving, showering, going to work at the office, when you know what is happening back home. And I just wonder how you handle it, mentally and emotionally.
Jay, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss the Uyghur issues. As you perfectly pointed out, the recent wave of escalated oppression, has been largely underreported. Personally grateful for your interest in inviting me to discuss a very important issue related to my personal and professional life. I'd like to be as normal as possible, as a free person, free American, living in this wonderful country in the last 23 years. But because of what's happening in the homeland, and that's because of what's happening to my own parents, relatives, and fellow Uyghurs, it's impossible to have a normal life. Let me put in perspective. Imagine that you have important holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, And most of us in the free world take that for granted. You drive up or get on a plane and go to your parents, go to your siblings. We don't have that kind of luxury. That's a luxury item for us. And also, imagine that you cannot attend your own parents' funeral services or cannot be at the hospital where your parents need care. I personally have not been back to my homeland in the last 23 years. This has been the case for most of us. But what keeps us...
If you return to East Turkestan, here's a bracing question for you. Pick your poison. Would they kill you or just imprison you?
3 possible scenarios. One, they will set you up with some domestic crime and lock you up. Or they will be very nice to you, and upon your return, your image within the diaspora community will be destroyed. Or they will be so nice to you, they're showing you around and then use your meetings and social engagement for their own propaganda purposes. So either way, it's not such a good idea to return to the homeland, even though you have emotional and personal connection to it.
Keep going with what you were saying before I interrupted.
So the Chinese government has been not only oppressing the Uyghur population within China, but also extended its oppression to countries like the United States, Australia, or Western Europe, trying to prevent free Uyghurs from speaking out. If you have any history of involvement in political life, let's say protests or supporting worldwide organizations such as World Uyghur Congress, that you're blacklisted. What
does that mean, blacklisted?
Blacklisted.
What can they do to you? They can harm your family and your friends in China, but can they harm you here personally in Washington or just get you through your family?
Guilt by association. They pressure your family members and they use your family members to keep you quiet or stay away from so-called problematic or troubling individuals. So,
is it a problem for you to be doing this interview?
No, not at all. Somebody has to speak out. Somebody has to speak out. I think this is a privilege for me being in this country and being educated and given the freedom. So I have to speak out.
In Burma, the government is doing terrible things to people called the Rohingyas. And their excuse is that some of them are militant. Some of them have taken up arms, which is true. And so they seize on this to destroy, to ethnically cleanse, what a strange term, the entire population. And they've raped and murdered and exiled virtually all of them. Does the CCP do this as well about the Uyghurs? Some Uyghurs, understandably, from my point of view, have become militant, have taken up arms. Does the CCP seize on this as a kind of excuse to oppress the entire population?
This is an interesting question, a very important question. You need to mention a few things. One, the word terrorism does not exist in the Uyghur dictionary. It's not even a Uyghur word. And two, the Chinese narrative describing or justifying its oppression has been varied over the years. In the 80s, there was they used their political propaganda machine to promote the government's interest. And in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they worried that Uyghurs may also demand an independent state. And they come up with this Strike Hard campaign. And then since 9/11,
what kind of campaign?
Strike Hard.
Strike Hard
campaign in the mid-90s. And then 9/11 happened to their benefit. They took advantage of the U.S.-led war on terror and exaggerated so-called Uyghur Islamic threat. It is true that there's some violent incidents took place in 2014-15. But the current, the ongoing oppression or ratcheted up oppression is not about terrorism. This is about cynicization or forced assimilation. So even a small percentage of the people decided to use violent means to send their message. That has already been taken care of in different levels, the organizational level, the community level. Even in the Chinese government own measure, the Urumqi is the safest place in China today. So with that, using war on terrorism, using Uyghurs' Islamic background as a propaganda tool, or justification when the countries like the United States or European Union or even Turkey raises a Uyghur concern. So to me, it was a scapegoat or excuse in the past, but now it's not about terrorism anymore, especially since last spring that they ratcheted up the pressure and come up with this mass detention facilities. So the narrative has changed. Their unstated goals have been changed. So there's no way to explain what they are doing relating it to terrorism.
I want to take a minute to explain why things have taken such a hard turn in this area of China in the last year. I think it mainly has to do with the arrival of a new sheriff in town, so to speak, a new governor of the region, a new Gauleiter, the Nazis called them, a man named Chen, who was very, very effective in Tibet. He was in Tibet for several years in order to subdue the population, create a police state, clamp down on everything, crack down on everything. He was really, really good at it. And the CCP, as I understand it, said, go to East Turkestan and do the same to the Uyghurs. And as I understand it, a gulag is not just sitting there ready to go. The infrastructure is not in place. And so what do? So there's been a great conversion of schools, in some cases hospitals, factories, into these re-education camps. And if there are 1 million in these camps, as Uyghurs claim, that's what, 1/10 of the population or something? In some areas, 40% of the adults have been rounded up.
That sounds about right.
And then disappeared. And I'd like to discuss with you, Nury, who these people are. As I understand it, it's not quite indiscriminate. If you're a teacher, someone who reads books, you're in big trouble. Reminds me of the Khmer Rouge, who went after people in Cambodia who wore glasses, right? Political people, religious people, they have very little chance. And also the young, as I understand it. They're scared of young people. Young meaning under 40. Mm-hmm. There's this post-1980 generation or generations that the CCP is apparently very afraid of. Nury, can just anyone be picked up in East Turkestan? How does it work, so to speak? What are the criteria of the Chinese authorities in arresting people and disappearing them?
First of all, that individual that you mentioned used to run the show in Tibet. He has proven to the central government that he can take care of the minority affairs. The Chinese government recycled top leaders between Tibet and East Turkestan. This has been the case in few top leaders. Even if it's an autonomous region, it has 3 governments basically. One is the Construction Corps, which is a paramilitary. Close to 3 million paramilitaries currently stationed in East Turkestan. That has its own court, schools, and even jails. And then the other one is the Communist Party. He's basically a king there. And then the regional government. Regional government head is usually a Uyghur guy, a puppet figurehead. So this individual, since his arrival to East Turkestan in 2016, has recommended a number of measures. One of which is de-extremification measure, which started being implemented April 1, 2017, that sanctions very basic things such as growing beard, adhering to halal diet, encouraging children to marry a Uyghur, speaking Uyghur language at home, even refusing to drink in the social events. Some Uyghur ladies were forced to drink in public.
So if you don't drink alcohol, you're in big trouble because that may suggest you're religious.
And also you can be accused of being two-faced. That is the accusation that they have been imposed to various well-known influential Uyghurs, such as the president of Xinjiang University, the president of Xinjiang Medical School, and number of musicians, philanthropists. They have been taken in, and there's one instance, the 80-some years old Islamic scholar who translated Quran from Arabic to Uyghur at the request of the Chinese government, were jailed and died in prison.
Has he been tortured to death?
That's what we've been hearing from his relatives and family members. It is hard to verify, confirm that information, but it's highly likely.
Nury, there's been some testimony that has leaked out from these camps, and some people have actually left the camps, lived to tell the tale, so to speak. What takes place in these camps?
These camps are basically a forced brainwashing machine set up by the Chinese government. The way that they pick up individuals are based on your travel history.
That's right. If you've traveled abroad, you're
Yes.
in trouble. If
Yes.
you've received a phone call from abroad, you're
Yes, people like me, if I call someone, that person will be accused of being colluded with outside forces or hostile forces. And then the other type of individual who also been locked up is the philanthropist. The wealthy Uyghurs set up Uyghur schools, orphanage, and providing goods to an area that suffered natural disasters. And also people in academia. They pick you up based on your past writing or public expression of your views. Sometimes maybe pro-Uyghur nationalism, or just glorifying some Uyghur history. We had a couple of thinkers, philosophers in Uyghur history. The Uyghurs are very good in poetry. Some of the poems are very, very subtle. If you have a history of publishing something, or if you're performing a Uyghur song that may, in a way, promote Uyghur nationalism, that can be also a crime. So the Chinese in a technological field are using artificial intelligence to pick up. This is all picked by machine. So that's why people don't know who will be next. They created this fear, making people to wonder, would that be me next time? Which of my family members will be picked up? Should I go to this event? The restaurants and the bazaars are almost empty because if you go talk to wrong people or associate or palling around with wrong people, you could be next. So they created this fear among the Uyghur people in their mindset that it's better for them just to stay home.
Nury, in the camps, if you submit to this indoctrination and agree to renounce your antiquated Uyghur ways, give up your religion, give up your language, if you agree to become a good secular Chinese communist, will they let you go?
We've been only hearing Senator Marco Rubio, Christopher Smith, a congressman from New Jersey, recently wrote a letter to U.S. ambassador in Beijing, said this concentration camp is the largest minority camp in today's world. We only know people going in. We're not hearing enough about people being able to get out. We only have two cases being reported. One is the Kazakh citizen who were tortured, detained for nearly 11 months. And there's other Uyghur student.
He beat his head against a wall
until
they
he
let
was
him go.
hooded when he was being transported around. And he was a Kazakh citizen. And just visiting his relatives in East Turkestan. And also this student who were sent to the camp and managed to get out. We gave an interview to one of the U.S. publications. But based on what we heard from the selective cases, they start their case. They wear jumpsuit, start their day with a flag-raising ceremony, and then they do a lot of self-critique. And then
Sounds like the Mao period.
Yes, the history.
That's what happened at the camp you were born in.
Right. And then what they do, and then they show videos or clips of Uyghur separates outside China. Or in some cases, they condemn the United States being a supporter of the Uyghur human rights. Two organizations receive funding from the National Endowment for Democracy. One of them is my organization. They believe that the United States also instigating this political trouble. And also in some cases, they go through physical labor. So it's very difficult to figure out what exactly happening because the Chinese government does not even acknowledge the existence of those re-education camps or concentration camps.
Let's pause. We're talking to Nury A. Turkel, who is a lawyer here in Washington and a native Uyghur and a human rights activist. I'm Jay Nordlinger with Q&A. Back after this word from our sponsor. Quick reminder that we're being sponsored today by Donors Trust. Did you know you actually have the ability to make a difference in stopping the slide away from the bedrock American ideals of liberty? Donors Trust, the Community Foundation for Liberty, wants to help you find those organizations doing the important work on the issues that matter the most to you. A donor-advised fund at Donors Trust gives you a way to simplify your giving, receive excellent tax benefits, and protect your privacy, all with a partner that understands and shares your commitment to a free society and limited government. So, are you ready to be more strategic in your giving? Go to donorstrust.org/ricochet to receive your free expert's guide to effective giving and see how you can use your charitable dollars to put free market ideas into action. You'll also receive a bonus, the Investing in Liberty Guide that offers a step-by-step process to strategically support America's bedrock principles through your giving. That's donorstrust.org/ricochet. Welcome back to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger. We're talking about East Turkestan and the Uyghurs with Nury Turkel. Nury, as I understand it, East Turkestan is the most heavily policed area in all the world. They've said it, that this genius, this evil genius who worked in Tibet, has set up a perfect surveillance state where there's no privacy whatsoever, and the entire population is DNA sampled, and biometrics are wielded against the population. I have a pretty good imagination, including a dark imagination. I can't really imagine what this is and how it works, but I bet you know.
The DNA sampling and forced to take blood samples have happened across the board. There are two ways of looking at it. One, Chinese government does not explain this. One is to establish profiles for the Uyghur population, and the other one is very grim and worrisome, which has been discussed in some Washington political events, that the Chinese government may use it for organ harvesting.
Organ harvesting.
Yes.
This has been done to Falun Gong practitioners.
Yes, and there's a case recently, one of the social media displayed a picture at the airport. It has an arrow. It says donated organs has to go through this way it shows the direction. Even at the airports, there's a way that they take it to places where it's supposed to go. So it's very difficult to ascertain or make sense of why exactly the Chinese government doing this DNA sampling. But it's very worrisome. We need to talk about this. Why would they do what they do? Their stated goal and unstated goal. The stated goal is to achieve stability. The Chinese has a huge geopolitical ambition. If you look at, when you look at the map, it explains a lot. The Uyghurs' homeland, East Turkestan, makes 1/6 of the Chinese territory. It has close to 600 international borders. It's a gateway to European and Central Asian market. And China's One Belt, One Road initiative will not be successful if the Chinese don't have a full control of the region. And also the Chinese wanted to do mass population resettlement. Without achieving so-called stability, no Chinese, Han Chinese will go there. And then the third, they tried different ways. Some of it may sound very liberal to you in the 80s to give Uyghurs certain social and religious rights. But now what they're trying to do is to force assimilation. So anything that is not in line with this Chinese notion, a great Han nationalism, then your problem. The Chinese sees Uyghur ethno-national identity as a feeding tube for future political unrest. To the Chinese
they use the word splitism, don't they?
Splitism was an old word. They used that in the 90s when the Soviet Union was collapsing. All the Turkic nations on the other side of the board were emerging as independent nations. They used that term splitism. And now they use, until recently, they used fight against three forces: separatism, terrorism, and Islamic fundamentalism. They changed the narrative and even the way that they... And also there has a domestic ramification for the Chinese. Chinese believe that if East Turkestan gets out of hand, it will have a domino effect to China-related areas such as Tibet, Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan.
Nury, in Uyghur land, in East Turkestan, are people terrified?
The Uyghur people describe their lives in two simple ways. One, they use this metaphor. The knife hit the bone. You can appreciate how hurtful that can be. And then two, they believe the environment that they live as if it's an open-air prison. You can do certain things, you can eat, you can go to your house to sleep, but you have no social freedom or political freedom. So the Chinese government created this atmosphere of fearfulness for the Uyghur people. It's typical Orwellian society. I have a quote from a young lady based in Rimchi, called her dad in Canada, said, "Dad, you left us, but Chinese police uncles are protecting us. Please behave." That's exactly how...
It's a warning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in a lot of Uyghur families have been cutting off connection to their overseas family members. I've been hearing free Uyghurs such as myself not being able to communicate their family members because the only way that they can do that is this popular social the telephone app called the WeChat, and a lot of them blocking their overseas family members. So there's a huge disconnect. I can name 2-3 people recently told me that they don't even know if their parents are still alive. So what is happening in the homeland is not staying there. It's affecting people like myself and creating emotional stress.
Almost all Uyghur families, as I understand it, have been affected by this in the last year. Almost every family has people disappeared, correct? And they're usually men? More men than women in these camps?
Yes, that's true. Let me put this in perspective. The country of Norway has 4 million population. So basically 1/3 of Norway population like situations happening. Let's say Chinese government says Uyghur population is about 10 million. If 1 million population has been taken away, that can almost empty up the society. That also, it's hard to find a family today. This may be news to most of you because this has not been reported widely. It's almost impossible to find a family that has not been affected. Number one. Number two, who are they targeting? They're only leaving the children alone. Anyone the Chinese government says specifically, the target is the people who were born in the 1980s and the 90s. It's pretty clear demographics that they're targeting for. And also, recently...
Well, hang on. What do they do with the children who are now orphans?
They do two things. One, give them for adoption, giving them away for adoption. And then two, send them to Chinese schools. Some of them in inland China, they send them far away from home. And some of them are in their respective place of residence.
So it's a great social engineering project.
It is. It's a very sad social engineering project that is taking place. And then one other thing that they've been doing is to give quotas to local police department. This has also been reported. In a villager level, they said a certain percentage of your population has to go to the re-education camp. How do you meet that quota? or requirement. So even police having difficulty to meet that requirement. There's a top-down approach. If the order comes from the central government or the Communist Party officials in Urumqi, the local level has to comply.
So, Nury, you and I are pretty blunt with each other. We don't beat around the bush. Jerry Cohen has these sort of genocidal premonitions. Will they kill them? Will they kill them in great numbers? Or will these people simply be zombies in a gulag for decades?
I, as a lawyer, as someone who has read the Genocide Convention, the legal definition clearly directs to the direction of a slow genocide is taking place, if not crimes against humanity. It's a loaded term. It requires a lot of arguments, lots of factual evidentiary support. But based on what they try to do, and based on the fear that we have for the possibility of mass extermination, because the Chinese government's language is very disturbing. This is a quote. They said, "You cannot eradicate the weed one by one. You have to apply some chemicals."
To kill the whole crop.
Yes, this is a quote by a top official.
Yeah.
And this has been repeated in a number of occasions. It's a chilling statement to hear in 21st century. Based on their motive, based on the acts that they've been committed, based on the evidence on the ground, I'm afraid that it's sliding towards that direction.
So almost no one knows about this. Except for China specialists and Radio Free Asia. Must be extremely frustrating. I bet you've spent the last 23 years explaining who the hell you are, what a Uyghur is. Must be very frustrating.
It is very frustrating. It is when you talk about the Uyghurs. I personally have faced a couple of issues. One, unlike the Tibetan cause, the Uyghur issues is largely unknown in the West.
You don't have any actors and actresses. You don't have any Hollywood.
We don't have Richard Gere, or we don't have Steven Seagal to promote the Uyghur cause. But what we've been able to do, especially since Bush years, 2001 and 2, all the way to 2010, the Uyghurs are given this Guantanamo case in the United States. I'm using that as an example. It was a bad situation, but it was very effective method, ways of explaining to the world, to the American people, who the Uyghurs are. It was this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Presidential statements were being made. So we used a very different method to promote the Uyghur cause. In other words, top-down approach as opposed to grassroots approach. But one major trouble is that, let's face it, that the Muslim people don't have a good reputation in the past.
No.
Yeah. So the Uyghurs not only...
It's another disadvantage of the Rohingyas.
Yeah. And the Rohingya, the people committing those crimes against Rohingya people are not China, that has a very intimate economic relationship with the West.
That's true.
So, they pick the enemy and fight. So in America, we've been successfully promoting the cause, but there's a certain level of lukewarm response. As soon as the word Islam or Muslim comes up,
believe me, I hear from readers and listeners. I know. Nury, let me ask you this. Marco Rubio writes letters. Chris Smith writes letters. It's always the same congressmen and senators. Yeah. The cast of characters never changes. It's always the same people who care.
Yeah.
It doesn't do anything, does it?
I'm personally very grateful to those members of Congress. But it is really sad that has not been really has been a public outcry.
Well, what do you want? Let me be blunt. What do you want?
I want a few things. One, I want President Trump to come to the podium and condemn this mass incarceration. It is.
Did the State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert, I don't know how to pronounce her name, I've only seen it written. She did this, did she not?
She did it after almost a year of asking the State Department to make a public statement. We're very, very thankful to her and the acting Secretary of State then, John Sullivan, mentioning the Uyghurs.
Okay, keep going. What do you want?
And we want public statement. We want a public condemnation. And then number two, we want Ambassador Nikki Haley to use her UN platform and organize like-minded governments to make a public statement. Draw attention. And then three, I want American people like yourself to do this kind of public education, because people, a world need to know. And the fourth, I want a greater coverage in the news media. And also U.S. government could do one other thing, which it was able to do during the Cold War, rally like-minded governments in Europe. The citizens of free world, like myself, being affected are much more in Europe than the United States. So Western Europe, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, England have a moral responsibility to speak up. The United States already made the statement. I think they should follow suit. So this should be a joint effort. Back in 2009, when there was an arrest, our Secretary of State talk to other relevant governments or like-minded governments or speak on one voice. I think that can be very effective. Chinese government knows exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it with impunity because there's no criticism. There's no public outcry. And let's don't forget, similar thing happened in the world history that we all despise. And why this issue is treated differently than the one that we already know and feel regret and feel sad or remorseful about.
You're talking about the Holocaust?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's how it started. As a historian, I could say this with certainty. The way that this has been set up, the way that they're gathering people based on ethnicity, based on political belief, religious values, very similar how Holocaust has started.
You believe this is an emergency.
It's an emergency.
Gary Cohen does. Sarah Cook does.
Yes.
Other China scholars.
Yes, I strongly
believe. This is an emergency.
This is an emergency. Just don't forget that close to 1 million people being locked up for no apparent reason other than being Uyghur.
They're not charged with anything.
They're not charged. The way that the Chinese government conducting this is even against their own constitution, and it's against their own criminal laws. That's probably why they're not talking about it. In China, if you want to arrest someone, you have to go through a prosecutor to get an arrest warrant. Very similar to civil laws in some countries. They follow that for the most part. But when it comes to the Uyghurs, perhaps when it comes to Tibetans, it's not in practice.
Well, Nury Turkel is with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And you're very brave. I don't quite know how you get up in the morning and go about your daily work, thinking about your native land and your family personally. Thank you for doing this interview with me, and I admire you no end. And I'll talk to you again.
Thank you very much.
I'm Jay Nordlinger for Q&A. So long.
Ricochet. Join the conversation.